Aloha, everyone. I'm Brian. I was born in Pittsburgh. I lived up and down the East Coast. I've been here in Hawaii the last 20 years. The kinds of things that we've always studied in my lab have been focused on how chemistry, biology, geology, physics work together, really biogeochemistry. I tell people all the time I'm not an engineer, I'm not a programmer, but I've worked closely with them my entire career. 10 years ago, I had 3 months of ship time, 3 different oceans doing deep sea hydrothermal vent research. My wife and I are about to have our second child. It's too much travel. I turned all of that kind of energy and interest in blending biogeochemistry and engineering to the coasts. And I've always worked in local coastal environments, including fish ponds here in Hawaii. I've talked about projects, fish ponds here in Hawaii. This is He'ia Fish Pond and a view of what our wet future in the coastline is going to be for a long time. And so in the spirit of talking about the tropical Pacific and communities, I'm not going to talk about the tropical Pacific. I'm going to do the bait and switch. I've talked a lot about our work in the fish ponds. We work with 30 different fish pond restoration groups. It's tough to fund that. It's tough to publish it. A lot of times the criticisms are, well, this is parochial. Where else does it work? And so what I'm going to talk about today is a story of out of the lab, into the fish ponds, but out of Hawaii and to the rest of the continent. And our pathway to do that was initiating a public-private. And so Hohonu, we were urged to start by university leadership. It's a Delaware C corporation, but it's also public-private in that the University of Hawaii is a partial equity owner in the company. Be happy to have a beer later and tell you about how all of that works. But we were initially kicked off down this pathway in my lab as a research project with a $10K seed grant from UH Grant 10 years ago. Turned that into a bunch of funding from NSF, literally entitled Democratization of Access to Ocean Observing Technologies. That was back in 2015. And then consistent funding from Schmidt Marine Technology Partners for the R&D aspects of these. These are not AI generated. This is current, right? But I think that also, we see TED Talks and sustainability and resilience and adaptation and mitigation are sometimes stovepiped, and they're not interchangeable, but they're also not independent concepts. And they don't need to be politically divisive. That's a typo. It's supposed to be divisive, but decisive maybe is just as applicable here. But these are sea level rise and climate change, but they're not, right? To anybody outside of this room or outside of academia, this is, I can't charge my Tesla, I can't get to work, I can't pick up my kids from preschool at high tide, my king tides, right? This road never used to flood before. And so I think that we owe it to ourselves to rethink that storytelling a little bit. I found this paper just a couple weeks ago on a flight up to Seattle, actually. I didn't know this group. I hadn't read this paper before, but unintended consequences of using maps to communicate sea level rise. This resonated with some of the anecdotal stories that we're getting time and time and time again, working with different communities. Flood maps can backfire. Coastal residents become more worried about flood risks when told how sea level rise will affect their daily commute than looking at maps or hazard risk mitigation maps. This resonates. So what we did was we cracked the nut on making cost-effective tools to measure especially water level, but other, the telemetry and the back-end cyber infrastructure was really the harder nut to crack. But the idea here is that the public is hungry for access to this kind of data. And that gets back to that democratization idea. Give it to them, and they want it. They're hungry for it. They need it for those stories, right? I can't pick up my kids from preschool during high tide. So, NOAA does a great job with the funds allocated. Co-ops has $37 million a year and operates 300 tide gauges for 95,000 miles of U.S. coastline. It's just simply not enough. Downtown Charleston, this blue pin, there's not another NOAA tide gauge until Fort Pulaski in Georgia. Every one of those purple pins, we didn't pick those by throwing darts at a map. Those are communities coming to us through SICORA, an Integrated Ocean Observing System Regional Association, and saying, subsidize the first one, let's put in these, let's come back and let's find ways, get creative, to put in new water level monitors at the spatial resolution that solve day-to-day problems, and then start to fill gaps for thinking about 5-year, 10-year coastal infrastructure planning. So it's not an inland gauge. We're not competing with co-ops. We work with folks at co-ops all the time. It's a different tool for a different application. The way we did it, it starts with a hardware component, and so it's not meant to look much, right? It's not meant to be an inline gauge. It's a PVC tube, and we've been working on the firmware and the hardware inside and the telemetry and the back-end cyber infrastructure and automating Quartart. How many people know what Quartart is? In this room, most, right? Quality assurance of real-time oceanographic data? No, you haven't read the manuals? Huh. I would have thought. Okay, so how do we know what we're getting in the environment is real? How do we detect anomalies? How do we do that when it's not just a professor and a student looking at 5 sensors, but envisioning filling that demand for 100,000 sensors for all of the continental US? right? That's when we need machine learning. That's when we need emergent data science tools. So I can tell you about the hardware. We'll talk about that. We've been working on it for 10 years. It's very robust. One of those sensors just survived not only 2 hurricanes in Lee County, but a direct hit with a tornado. So people ask all the time, like, how robust are these low-cost sensors? Are they good? Are they high-quality data? We survived a tornado after 2 hurricanes, during 2 hurricanes. The harder nut to crack really was more the data science and envisioning a pathway to make this scalable, reproducible at those 10,000, 100,000 scale deployments for across the US. We were funded by the Schmitz, and we worked with the Data Science Institute at the University of Chicago, working with card-carrying PhD-level data scientists, replicating that, right? What does a professor, what does a student, what does a postdoc do when they look at tide gauge data? How do we detect anomalies? How do we make this scalable? That 80% better than NOAA, that's not a ding, right? It's just, you know, we're starting with tidal harmonic predictions. We're also ingesting other MET data, and we also have, right, the gap filling capabilities. So, you know, day over day, up to 7 days out, over a year, we're roughly 80% more accurate than a tidal harmonic prediction at a site. But again, that's not a ding, it's just a different way of looking at it. Some of our first customers were, you know, mayors in South Carolina. They say, oh, we love the web data portal, we love the publicly available dashboard, but what we really want is, you know, I want to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning to a text message alert saying I need to deploy flood barriers, I need to reroute ambulance traffic. So we also developed Tidecast. This is an app in the iOS store. It's the only app that gives live data, not just harmonic predictions. We ingest all of NOAA co-op NLON gauges and our own as well. It's working, right? So we partnered with NOAA. We work with multiple regional associations of IUs, Sea Grant offices, National Estuarine Research Reserves, co-ops. Inundation Dashboard has some of our sensor data on it. We're currently deployed in 16 states, about 160 locations. And these are, again, low-cost water level sensors. We're pinging every second, like a bat, right, measuring distance down to that water level. We can deploy really cheap ultrasonic sensors or slightly more expensive, but still pretty cheap, microwave radar sensors, and get them out there in places where you wouldn't invest $300K to put an NLON gauge, right? So we're really starting to tackle that, that spatial variability question. This is a case study working with Socorro and the water level network that was funded with the last iteration of the IUS renewals. If you go on co-ops, tides and currents, and look at the inundation dashboard today for Beaufort, South Carolina, station operated by Honolulu, we're one of the first ones who aren't coming from within NOAA data, providing NOAA co-ops data on the dashboards. Real-time, high spatial resolution. Something magical happens when you give sensors to the public and they're not ours anymore. The instrumentation, the data isn't as foreign as Mars rovers anymore, so there's some believability in it. There's that sense of custodial ownership, and you start to do things with them that you wouldn't do with a $300,000 or $10,000 package for that matter. City of Boston came to us and said, we want to understand flooding. We have a tide gauge, there's an NLON gauge in downtown Boston Harbor, but this is the end of Long Wharf Pier. And that gauge isn't always right to let us know what's happening here. We're 100 yards behind where Kevin and I are standing there. You know, that's not a tide gauge anymore. It's the same tech stack for us. It's still pinging, but 90% of the time, that sensor is measuring distance to dry marble, right? That's its job until it's not. And second by second, we're pinging in data, uploading 1-minute averages as an inundation sensor, giving real-time information to emergency first responders, as well as the public, as well as Boston Public Transportation, which has a station 100 yards behind us there. This opens up what modelers want to be able to do, and you haven't been able to do from satellites either, right? So we're filling a gap between the promise of modeling that hopefully we'll get to and where we are today with remote sensing. The y-axis here is NAVD88, so Tinian Beach down here at the bottom is lower lying than Morrissey Boulevard up at the top. These were king tide events coming through March. The blue line is that Boston Harbor NLON gauge. You can see about a foot of flooding at Tinian Beach and just a little blip at Long Wharf. But then when we fast forward here between the 10th and the 11th, that particular flooding event was high enough to flood those 4 high priority sites for the city of Boston. By doing this, we're getting a spatial picture in real time that was previously cost prohibitive. And by doing this, we're now instituting new time series at locations. Not all floods are created equal. So the different purple shades here are different flooding events for one of those gauges. And the irony, of course, of having waterfront opportunities for rent with the water literally coming in the doorway, right? This has larger implications than just publishing papers and graduating students, right? Real estate, insurance, reinsurance, hazard risk assessment is all really interested in this level of granularity that has long been promised and not delivered on. Establishing a new time series, right? Dave Carl years ago told me, never start a time series, but if you start one, never end one, right? There's a lot of complexity that goes in with time series, but by establishing new locations, we're able to make really good predictions. So I was in Seattle last week at an OCM workshop. Co-ops was predicting a 10% chance for moderate flooding in Boston. We were predicting 98% chance of 1.5 feet of flooding at Tinian Beach, 98% chance of 1/2 of flooding at Long Wharf. We were right. So again, having access to that kind of granularity is important for forecasting. Community homeowners associations, emergency response. This is our latest video case study on the web. Chief of Fire and Emergency Response. This is out on Cape Cod, Great Island, a community about 60 to 70. Has a 3-mile-long causeway with 4 feet of water over that causeway for 8 hours. Right? Somebody has a heart attack in one of those 70 homes, and that sensor's not there measuring water level. You send an ambulance or emergency response, they have to turn around or call in a helicopter. Lives can be lost for those kinds of delays, and it's now cost effective to do these kinds of instrumentation deployments. Hurricane Ian came through Florida a couple years ago. There's one Enlon gauge at Fort Myers, way up here. They got wiped out and had no granular data thinking about evacuations or evacuating people who were supposed to evacuate. So Lee County Public Emergency came to us, and we deployed 13 gauges in September of this year and gave them a really good granular installation. In a lot of cases, our customers are deploying these themselves. They know how to put things out in the environment. They take care of the permitting. They have GIS friends who can come in and do the RTK surveys. So we can get really, really high integrity data without the costs of doing it all ourselves, and we can pass that savings along to make it cost effective for these deployments. In Lee County, they were really interested in this intersection during this was Hurricane Milton, I think. So the top panel here is the Enlon gauge at the Fort Myers station right here, and right around the corner is that intersection. This is a Florida DOT webcam looking at that. That really captures the public's interest, and then we're able to quantify it. Is there some noise? Yeah, sure, right? It's a hurricane. But we're getting better and better at filtering out this noise using machine learning in real time, and post-processing, no problem at all. This illustrates some of that. So the orange line here is our post-processing machine learning algorithm. The blue, right, this is an acoustic sensor. It's a temperature-compensated ultrasonic sensor. We know it has limitations for wind and humidity in the air gap, but we're getting better at understanding how that and predicting it. Then, afterwards, we're working with co-ops, we're working with National Hurricane Center to say, there's not another tide gauge all the way up until Tampa. Right, so we can really start to fill in some gaps about storm surge, understand the differentiation between the wind field and that storm surge arrival. 30 miles up the river at Orange River, which has never been instrumented before, the lag between the storm surge and the compound flooding from the runoff, and how that affected, and not only once, but twice with both hurricanes Helene and Milton in a 6-week period. So again, that question of how durable are they? Is it going to play? Okay. So the time series data here, yeah, we've got a few spurious data points, but this is a direct hit from a tornado during a hurricane. Our sensor is in that field of view, still pinging out 1-minute average water level data. We couldn't be more proud of how this performed. Emergency services as well. This was unprompted. This is the Director of Public Safety at Lee County, going on LinkedIn and kind of talking about the value of more granular data to fill the gaps and fill the needs that we previously had looked at cost prohibitively. I'm sure I'm out of time, but snap a FAQ or just drop me a line. I'd be happy to chat.